Hello, in this lesson we're going to begin scripting with construction script to be able to randomly place foliage, or really any static mesh, on the ground of our level and be able to do so only within a certain volume. So we're going to start doing this by creating a new blueprint class of an actor type, and we're going to call this BP underscore random prop placement. Now let's go ahead and double click on this to open it, and we'll start adding some components and talking about exactly what this is going to do. So the first component we need to add in our components tab is a new scene component. This will replace our default root, so we'll call it root. Next, we need to add a billboard component, and this billboard is going to be called editor visual. The reason we're adding this is we want to be able to see where this blueprint is placed inside of our level, and we actually aren't going to be able to have one central place that we can visually see where the blueprint is unless we add something like a billboard component. Now this billboard component is actually set by default to be hidden in game, so it's not going to be something that shows up when your game is running, but it'll let you be able to see where this blueprint is and click on it in the editor so you can select it to be able to move it around and make any adjustments to it. Now the next two things are what are actually going to be the components we use to create all of the functionality for this blueprint. First, we need to find a box collision component, and this is going to be our spawning volume. And then we're going to find another component, and in this one that we're going to add, we need to find an instanced static mesh component. And we'll actually call this SM for static mesh underscore instances. Now this is all the components we need to get the functionality we want. What we're going to do, we'll actually go ahead and compile and save, and then we'll actually go ahead and add one of these to our level. We'll add it right here. So you can see now that we have this basically raptor dragon head sitting right here. Now what this is going to let us do is, first the raptor head is letting us see it in the editor so we can actually click on it. Then this box is going to be our volume. Now we called it a spawning volume because what we're going to be doing is essentially spawning new static meshes inside of this volume. But they're not really going to be spawning new ones so much as making new instances of static meshes with our instance static mesh component. Now the reason we need a volume is what we're going to do is we're going to pick random points within this volume. So in this case it would be a really small volume, but we're going to pick random points in this volume and then draw a line trace down to the ground to find out where on the ground we hit, and then add an instance of a static mesh there. And it's going to be randomly selected, so we'll get a random distribution of how many ever instances of a static mesh we specify within the volume. So this is going to take several lessons for us to complete all the scripting necessary to do this. So we're going to break this up into several lessons, so we're just going to do small sections at a time, and I'll explain them as we go. So let's go ahead and jump into construction script. The very first thing we need to do is actually a performance related thing, and that we need to basically take our SM instances, so our instance static mesh component, get a reference to it, and we need to then from there search for shadow. And there's a rendering, under the rendering section, there's a node called set cast shadow. I'm going to set this up. Now the reason we're doing this is we are going to possibly have hundreds of static meshes that we're going to place inside of this volume. And sometimes, for performance reasons, you won't want to have each one of those instances cast a shadow. Especially if you have anything that's dynamic with those static meshes, if you have them movable or something like that. So we want to be able to turn off this shadow casting to be able to have a performance boost, so we're not going to have those extra shadows. So we want to go ahead and actually right click on new cast shadow and tell it to promote to variable, and we'll call this B cast shadows. And we'll go ahead and make this editable, and we'll put the tooltip as whether or not to cast shadows. Now the reason I called this B cast shadows is a lowercase b at the beginning of a variable is to indicate that it's a Boolean type. It's just a naming convention in Unreal Engine 4. Now let's also set the category for this variable as setup. So this is where all of the variables that we'll be using to control this particular blueprint through construction script will all be in this setup category. So we're going to click compile and save to do that. Now the next thing we need to do, let's first clean up this node. There we go. So this is kind of the first thing. We're just going to throw that in there so that we can adjust this. We'll go ahead and make this true for cast shadow, so I can show you what it looks like with it on, and then we can turn it off if we need to. So compile and save. Now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to set the box extent, which is basically the size of this volume. So we'll know exactly where in our level that we want to be randomly spawning or randomly creating all of these instance static meshes. So in order to do that, we need a reference to our spawning volume, and we need to drag from there, and we need to search for box, B-O-X, and we will see that we have under the components box section, a set box extent. So go ahead and click on that. And here we want to, this box extent, we want this to be a variable, so we can actually set this inside of the editor when we're placing this in our level. So we need to right click on this and say promote to variable. So we're going to call this variable spawn volume extent. And we'll go ahead and make this editable, make a tooltip that says the size of the spawn volume. And then we'll go ahead and change its category to setup. And click compile and save. So now we'll be able to adjust the size of the box. So if we go back to our Park tab, we can now see that our volume actually is gone, and that's because we didn't set a default value for our spawn volume. So let's go ahead and go back to our spawn volume extent inside our blueprint tab, and let's go ahead and set the default to let's say 200 in all directions. So 200, 200, 200. Compile and save. Now if we go back to our main map tab, we will see that we actually have a box, it's right here, that is 200 in all directions. So let's go ahead and actually make this box as big as this area here of our level. So you can click on the little raptor head here, and we can say, well, we'll leave the Z at 200. We'll make the X maybe about, I think that was around 1,000 long. Yeah, we'll go ahead and round that off to 1,000. And for Y, we'll kind of up that to maybe there. So that's about 450 if we round up. So now we have a nice large volume. And this is the area where we will be able to pick those random points to add our static meshes. Now the one last thing we're going to do in this lesson before pausing to switch to another lesson video is that we're going to set up a length for our line trace. Now, what we're going to be doing is picking a bunch of random points, and then we'll need to do a line trace from those points down to the ground so that we can determine where on the ground we need to actually place the static meshes. Because maybe our ground isn't flat. Maybe it's some rolling hills, or maybe there's some other object there that we want to be able to spawn these instance meshes on top of. So what we need to do is first create a new variable, and this is going to be our line trace length, and this needs to be a float value. And we're actually going to set this category to a category of settings. So this is going to be basically everything that we're going to make public or editable is going to be in our setup section. Everything that's not, this kind of behind the scenes implementation details, are going to be in settings. So we're not going to make this editable. So what we need to do is we need to actually set how long this line trace is. And how we're going to do that is pretty simple. We're going to go ahead and drag this out and say set. This will be the next thing we do. Now, how we're going to set this is we're going to take our spawn volume extent, which is how big our spawn volume is. We're going to get that. And then we're going to right click on this and say split struct pin, so we get X, Y, and Z. So we're going to take the Z value, which is the height of our spawn volume. We're going to then multiply it by an integer value, so int times float. The int is going to be -1, and we're going to put that into our line trace length. Now what this is we are going to basically have our line trace length be the same as the height of our spawn volume, and we're making it negative because what we're wanting to do eventually is we're wanting to have all of our line traces start at the very top of this volume and go down into it, but only go as far as the volume. So if we actually drug this up in the air, then nothing would actually be spawned because there's no ground, there's no actually anything inside of this spawning volume. So that'll wrap up for this video. I'll go ahead and pull this back down so the volume is connecting with the ground. Go ahead and make sure you compile and save, and then in the next lesson we'll continue scripting this blueprint.